We have reached week 2 in the COVID-19 Masterclass. I'm Jackie Haddingham, manager of the Otago Global Health Institute, OGHI for short. This webinar will be an hour. We will finish at around 1 p.m. New Zealand time. Our webinars are all being recorded and will be available on the OGHI website later. We are also live streaming through the OGHI Facebook page. During the webinars, each presenter or speaker will present their talk. Then you can ask questions at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will then read the questions aloud for the speaker to respond. If we're not able to get through all the questions in the session, we'll ask the speakers to provide written responses, which we'll then post on the OGHI website. Our first speaker this morning, Professor Robert Patman, is one of the University of Otago's inaugural sesquicentennial distinguished chairs. And his research interests concern international relations, global security, US foreign policy, great powers, and the Horn of Africa. Robert will discuss how has COVID-19 affected the global geopolitical situation. Robert.
Thank you, Jackie. Tēnā koutou katoa. My presentation, as Jackie indicated, is on COVID-19, the geopolitical context, and also what this means for New Zealand. And I intend to speak for about 20 minutes and very happy to take your questions. I think there's 3 key takeaway points. Firstly, COVID-19 is a disruptive event which will redefine the new normal in what has been a prolonged international transition since the end of the Cold War in 1989. A second takeaway point, that there will be no return to the pre-globalization era, and states sooner or later, and sometimes despite themselves, will be obliged out of self-interest to extend international cooperation in the future. A third takeaway point is that COVID-19 has consolidated New Zealand's status as a minor power. Often in New Zealand, we think of ourselves as a small state and one that is barely relevant to international politics. This is simply not true. And I think COVID-19 has, if you like, boosted New Zealand's presence on the international stage. And I think Wellington should reset its foreign policy to actively work with like-minded states, particularly liberal democracies, to strengthen the rules-based international system on which New Zealand and these states critically depend. So permit me to give you a sort of an executive summary overview of what I'm going to say. The COVID-19 global pandemic is a disruptive event with geopolitical implications. It is reframing the international order as we have known it, and that order, since the end of the Cold War, has been torn between the opposing forces of nationalist fragmentation and international cooperation or integration. States like New Zealand have seen their international credibility rise significantly, and this could open the door to a new strategy of reinvigorated multilateralism to deal with the ever-increasing, quote, problems without passports that the late Kofi Annan spoke of. The COVID-19 crisis has confirmed the near breakdown of an international rules-based order that New Zealand and a number of other liberal democracies had almost taken for granted. Even before COVID-19, the liberal world order, which is another way of saying the international rules-based order, was struggling. But the global pandemic has brought its problems to a head. COVID-19 has highlighted the absence of an effective international crisis management system, with the UN Security Council largely marginalized during the global pandemic. And this crisis has also revealed that traditional allies of New Zealand, like the United States and the UK, which are both, both currently led by populist governments, can no longer be relied upon to provide international leadership in a multilateral setting. What should be done? The global pandemic is a good time, I would argue, for New Zealand to reset its foreign policy. by clearly rejecting the politics of populism, isolationism and protectionism, Wellington should actively champion, along with like-minded states, an international rules-based order as the most realistic approach to global challenges that do not respect borders. Just a few words on the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 global pandemic is only the latest in a long line of preventable catastrophes and disasters. As we know, since late November 2019, the COVID-19 has spread from the Chinese city of Wuhan to more than 180 countries and territories, affecting every continent except Antarctica. To date, there has been almost 500,000 deaths worldwide from COVID-19 and more than 10 million confirmed cases worldwide. So let me now talk about the geopolitical context. Most observers agree that a post-COVID-19 world will be different. But beyond that, opinion is sharply divided. And what I would like to do is lay out for you two quite diametrically opposed perspectives on the geopolitical environment since COVID-19 has affected us. On the one hand, there are scholars and diplomats who believe the impact of the lockdown responses to COVID-19 in many nations will reinvigorate nationalism at the expense of globalization, which is seen as a project that has failed. Amongst other things, it is argued that the interconnectedness of the contemporary world has exacerbated the medical and economic impact of COVID-19, and that nation states are now pushing back against this trend by strengthening their status as the world's most important and legitimate players. Now, according to this perspective, the emerging global order from the time of COVID-19 onwards will be characterized by deglobalization and protectionism and by intensified geopolitical competition between the great powers like the United States and China. So that's one perspective, that the world will become more inward looking and that other problems which do not recognize boundaries, such as COVID, such as climate change, attempts to deal with them will be postponed as a result. A second perspective is quite different. Other observers and scholars see globalization as a structural change powered by revolutionary changes in digital and communications technology, with these changes beginning in the early 80s. According to this perspective, globalization has made the world more interconnected and that states will not be able to reverse this trend. That is to say, you can no more deglobalize than you can deindustrialize. It's striking that during the COVID-19 crisis, the world, in the words of Anthony Elliott at South Australian University, has, quote, the world has witnessed a surge of digital information which has turbocharged virtual networks and the flow of ideas in everything from healthcare to business, unquote. Now, according to this view, there'll be no return to the pre-globalization era, and states confronted by transboundary challenges that they cannot control will be obliged sooner or later, out of self-interest, if nothing else, to seek much greater international coordination and support in this international transition. In other words, the impact of COVID-19 will sensitize states to the fact that there are no unilateral solutions to problems like COVID-19 and climate change, and they will have to make the necessary adjustments and cooperate to try to deal with problems they can't otherwise control. On balance, I think the latter perspective appears to be more likely for several reasons. That is the view that that COVID-19 will accelerate globalization rather than stall it. Why do I believe that? Firstly, I've described COVID-19 as a disruptive event. If you look at other disruptive events in the past, such as industrialization, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the end of the Cold War, all these events led to the emergence of new perspectives, daily routines, new power relations, and indeed new forms of resource distribution. Secondly, the response of states to the COVID-19 pandemic has been very revealing and has highlighted a clear fault line in global politics. But this fault line also is important because it gives us some indication, I believe, of things to come. Some of the highest death rates from COVID-19 are found in states with populist governments, such as the United States, the UK, and Brazil. These states seemed initially indifferent to warnings from the World Health Organization, such as the warning on the 30th of January that COVID-19 was, quote, a public health emergency of international concern, unquote. In addition, these governments appeared impervious to the public concerns of many healthcare experts in their respective countries. Their governments continue to emphasize a sense of national exceptionalism in the face of a virus which didn't respect borders. And as a result, they were painfully slow to react to the threat as the virus quickly grew, as the threat of the virus quickly grew. In contrast, the nation states that have performed relatively well in keeping COVID-19 related deaths to relatively low levels, these countries include South Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Singapore, Hong Kong, and New Zealand. What these states have in common is they acted early on the advice of the WHO, the World Health Organization. They consulted with a wide range of scientific and healthcare expertise, and they were prepared to learn from each other. In the New Zealand case, for example, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has often referenced the experience of other countries in dealing with this problem, not least countries like South Korea and Singapore. A third factor, which I think tilts us towards the view that COVID-19 will accelerate globalization and make the world even more interconnected, is this: that many of the problems facing sovereign states, not just COVID-19, COVID-19 is not a one-off, and this is an important point to establish. Many of the problems facing all sovereign states, large and small, do not recognize borders and cannot be resolved unilaterally. Here, climate change in particular looms large. It is unfolding more slowly than COVID-19, but will have far greater consequences. At the same time, so just to summarize that point, all sovereign states are increasingly confronted by problems which do not recognize boundaries and which by definition cannot be resolved on a national basis. They have to be resolved on an international basis. At the same time, the recent global protests in response to the brutal police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis indicated that we are witnessing in the 21st century the stirrings and the rise of international civil society, in which issues previously considered as domestic issues can quickly become internationalized. So these changes then, these factors are some of the reasons why I personally tilt towards the second interpretation, that we're going to see a new form of international relations and that the international order is changing. In other words, there'll be no return to the past. It won't be business as normal after COVID-19. What does this mean, this new geopolitical context? What does it mean for New Zealand? Since the end of the Second World War, New Zealand has been a firm supporter of multilateralism and what is known as the liberal international order, or the rules-based international order. For middle range and relatively small states like New Zealand, multilateralism, with multilateralism we're talking about the focus on international cooperation and norms associated with it. This, for small states like New Zealand, multilateralism offers the prospect of a voice and an influence on international issues that would not otherwise be possible in a self-help state system based largely on power. In other words, for countries like New Zealand, indeed the vast majority of countries in the international system, rules help to level the landscape and mean that issues are not decided by raw power alone. So for a country like ours, which does not have the power to make its own rules in the world and determine its own future, international rules are very important. Amongst other things, the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the absence of global leadership with no effective crisis management system. And in addition, not only has there been a lack of global leadership, we haven't seen the superpowers, the United States and China, taking charge and mobilizing international support and solidarity against this virus, which makes no distinctions between nations. At the same time, we've also seen, and this has been disquieting to many of us, that nation states like the United Kingdom, the United States and Brazil seem to be ruled by leaders who apparently put their national pride and political interests above the safety and lives of their own citizens. New Zealand has a vital stake in defending the rules-based multilateral system against its adversaries. But New Zealand and other supporters of the liberal order must do more than defend, if you like, the rules-based status quo. They must deepen it. So what are the challenges ahead for New Zealand in the post-COVID-19 era? For one thing, New Zealand must link its relatively successful efforts to suppress COVID-19 with a measured strategy of opening up to the world. We've heard a lot of talk in New Zealand about we can't really open up to the world until we've completely ended internal transmission of the virus. I think the two have to be linked. That is to say, the principle of linkage means that New Zealand should establish diplomatic openings or bubbles, to use the terminology, only with states that have performed well in countering the threat of COVID-19 and states that present a minimal threat to the gains made against the virus in New Zealand since late March. Now, this measured approach could generate a trans-Tasman or even some sort of Asia-Pacific bubble. But it would certainly mean that restrictions on all visitors from states like the United Kingdom, the US, and Brazil. In other words, I think as we continue to do well against COVID-19 in New Zealand, we should be looking to open up, but gradually and selectively, with those states which have also performed well in dealing with this crisis. And we should be very wary of opening this country's commercial and diplomatic links with countries like the United Kingdom, the US and Brazil, which haven't really followed best practice and haven't always listened to the advice given by the WHO. A couple other points I would like to mention before finishing. Credible global leadership is not going to be established until there is a more effective international machinery for dealing with such problems as COVID-19. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the UN Security Council has failed to take the initiative with response to this crisis. The UN Security Council clearly needs to be reformed. At present, the permanent members of the Security Council, known as the P5 group, have the privilege of being able to veto any UN Security Council resolution they do not like. The brutal 9-year civil war in Syria is a sad reminder that the use of the veto has made the UN Security Council incapable of delivering either stability or justice to places that are in desperate need of it. And as I mentioned in a book with Professor Lloyd Davis in 2015, which was on the subject of science diplomacy, the veto power of the P5 group should be abolished or severely circumscribed to enable more effective responses to global pandemics like COVID-19. Third, it's time for a serious international debate on how the liberal internet economic system can be made to work better for more people. COVID-19 has starkly revealed some really tremendous inequalities, both within countries and across countries. While there may be little consensus about what a reformed liberal economic order might look like, the current situation where 26 billionaires have as much wealth as half the world's population is not morally acceptable or politically sustainable going into the future. So let me summarize my remarks. Above all, the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated to New Zealand and many other states that neither the United States or China can be relied upon to protect their vital interests in an interconnected world at a time of a global pandemic like COVID-19. In the circumstances, New Zealand and other small states and middle-level powers will have to move out of their comfort zone and accept the challenge of moving away from what might be described as top-down multilateralism, where many states like New Zealand look to superpowers like America or China to lead. They must move from that reflex to a more bottom-up, proactive, strategic form of multilateralism that is capable of mobilizing international support for long overdue institutional reforms and also strengthening the international rules-based order in which they have a vital stake. In other words, New Zealand's foreign policy reset following this crisis involves a willingness to combine with like-minded countries to develop the international machinery so that we can more effectively deal with challenges which do not, like COVID-19 and climate change, which do not recognize national boundaries. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Robert, for a most thought-provoking talk. We have a few questions that have come through. Firstly, what is your view on the US terminating its relationship with the World Health Organization during the pandemic? Will this leave a power vacuum in the organization, and how will it directly affect countries like New Zealand?
It's a very good question. And it's ironic because the WHO was warning the Trump administration from late January onwards about COVID-19, but many of those warnings were disregarded. Right through to about March the 17th, the Trump administration was maintaining that COVID-19 was a problem that had been exaggerated and would disappear sometime in April. So the interesting thing is that the Trump administration has removed itself from the body which was actually warning the United States on the actions it should have taken much earlier. It clearly weakens the WHO, but I think it's incumbent on the rest of the international community to fill the financial shortfall that's been caused by America withdrawing from it. And by the way, Mr. Trump's actions are not widely supported in the United States. There are lots of critics, not least in the Republican Party, of what Mr. Trump has done. So I think it's important in the interim that other countries, perhaps the EU, China, and the middle range countries such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, combine their efforts to make sure that the WHO is not handicapped by this withdrawal of US support.
Thank you. Can you explain why the UN Security Council was not able to work with the World Health Organization during the pandemic?
Yes, well, we often think of the UN Security Council as being an entity in itself. It's not. It's only as strong or as weak as its members allow it to be. And there are 5 members on the permanent members of the Security Council. These are the ones that call the shots. They are China, Russia, the United States, Britain, and France. And there, amongst at least 3 of those members, with the exception of perhaps France and China, at least 3 of the permanent 5 were skeptical about international institutions like the WHO. So that's probably one of the factors why the UN Security Council was not as supportive as it could have been and worked closely as it could have done with the WHO. You know, in a sense, to answer your question very concisely, I think great power politics played a role in blurring or impeding cooperation between the WHO and the UN Security Council.
Thank you. I'm sure some more questions will come through soon. We haven't had any yet, but perhaps while we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, are there any other insights you may want to share, Robert, that you didn't get to cover during your talk? Not to put you on the spot, but anything else you'd like to add?
Well, the only thing I'd like to develop a little bit is that I think clearly this has been a very difficult period for many people, but I think in a sense, what we're seeing is a remarkable change in global politics. And I think one of the ironies of the present situation, we've seen China and Russia use COVID-19 as a reason to intensify their rivalry. But let's think about this. They're intensifying their rivalry over an issue neither of them can control. And I think that points to a significant insight for the future, is that we are, as I said in my presentation, we are confronted with the problems that we cannot control. And I think this will pay, that is to say, there is no unilateral solution to COVID-19. And so I think that is putting a tremendous onus now on perhaps the silent majority, the number of states in the international system which have tended to defer to the great powers. If you read our media, you often would think that great powers run the world. Well, they would certainly like to, but we live in the world in the 21st century where more great powers are more vulnerable and more interconnected than ever before. But that does, the good news is, that gives an opportunity for the smaller powers to exercise much greater influence. But it's one thing to have the opportunity, you also have to take the opportunity that is now available. And I think there is, Jacinda Ardern has shown with her leadership during the COVID-19 crisis, and also immediately after the Christchurch atrocity last year, in March last year, when 51 people tragically lost their lives through an act of terrorism, I think Jacinda Ardern's contribution has been highly evaluated internationally. A number of people who based in New Zealand have had this experience when dealing with international colleagues. People express their admiration of how this country has performed. And I think many people in the world would like to see greater input from countries like New Zealand on key international issues which affect everyone. And I hope we are in a position to make that contribution.
Thank you. Can you comment on the potential to direct economic resources designed to mitigate the downturn in our economy towards investment in climate change mitigation?
Yes, well, first of all, we have to recognize that there is a climate change crisis. And, you know, until we get a political consensus, both domestically and internationally on this issue, then the issue that's been raised cannot be effectively tackled. It's clearly, if we have international agreement, remember the United States withdrew from the Paris Accord on climate change in 2017, which has weakened that agreement, hasn't killed it, but it's weakened it. Yes, I mean, we have some tough questions ahead. And, but I would say recognition that this is a major problem. Clearly, climate change in the long term cannot be tackled until we move to an alternative energy paradigm. So the allocation of economic resources towards that is going to be, I suspect, quite a divisive issue, but an important one. And climate change is, if you like, another illustration of what we're seeing with COVID-19, a problem which does not recognize national boundaries and which by definition can only be resolved on a global basis. So yes, we do need to lead by example. We do need to be seeing that we're doing our bit internationally to conform with the Paris Accord on climate change, but I think we do need more impetus internationally. In short, we need to recognize there is a major crisis. This is the biggest threat facing human life on Earth in the foreseeable future, so we need to deal with it.
Thank you, Robert. We're out of time, but we still have a few questions to go. And perhaps while we're getting our second speaker set up, we might continue to run through the questions.
Sure.
Bear in mind that there may be a slight noise in the background while we're getting our second presentation set up. But let's continue the questions until our speaker is set up. I'm hoping that our technician will be able to help with that. So bear with us if there's a little bit of a disruption, but we'll continue with one or two questions for Robert until the other presentation is ready. Robert, do you have any comments on how the pandemic might affect upcoming elections, with election years in both New Zealand and the US?
I'm not sure my predictions are better than anyone else's. I mean, somebody once said a week is a long time in politics, so politics is a volatile business. I would say that if you look at the United States, I think Mr. Trump's political base of support is being eroded by the rapidly rising number of deaths. And Mr. Trump has persisted with the idea, the notion that everything was under control. That clearly is not the case. And with 122,000 deaths and rising, I think whatever a government says about its performance, those number of deaths prevent an inconvenient reality that the person running for office has to deal with. So I would not be surprised if COVID-19 has actually made a significant intervention in American politics. In New Zealand, very difficult to predict. We've seen the major opposition party have just changed their leadership. They seem to be getting a bit of a bounce from that. But I think there's widespread international and certainly national admiration for Jacinda Ardern's leadership. And I think logically one would expect the incumbent Labour-led government to get some bounce from that performance. But as I say, a lot can happen between now and September in the New Zealand case. So I hesitate to say more than on the face of it, Jacinda Ardern should benefit politically from her I think it was outstanding leadership. It was a combination of compassion, but also a willingness to take decisive action with quite an early lockdown. Won the support of people, both from her own support base in the Labour Party, but a lot of people who identify themselves as national supporters also admired that combination of compassion but decisive action as well.
Thank you, Robert. A lot of food for thought there.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, and thanks once again to Professor Patman for being here today,